Hello, and welcome back to Epistem. This week's episode will be continuing the sustainability series that we've been doing, and the paper that we're looking into is titled Analyzing the Impact of Changing Landscape Pattern and Dynamics on Land Surface Temperature of Lucknow City, India. So, this paper itself goes into different ways to lower the heat index that's being radiated from cities and being able to lower the heat, whether it be by adding green space, changing the layout of the urban area, or changing the surroundings. I'm Luke. And I'm Hunter. And you're listening to Epistem, a show where we explore papers in STEM fields and let you know what they're all about.
So let's go ahead and get into the paper. So what this study addresses is how changing landscape patterns affect surface temperature. So changing landscape patterns here just being another way of saying urban expansion, or building up a city, the population grows, the infrastructure grows with it, more buildings, more skyscrapers, and with that the reduction of green space, so parks, trees, bodies of water, things like that. So surface temperatures, what's the big deal with those? Why is it important if they rise or if they fall? Increasing surface temperatures lead to what's known as an urban heat island, which is basically just a concentration of increased temperature where there are a lot of people and a lot of buildings and roads and whatnot. And these urban heat islands are known to be a cause of environmental degradation. It affects the surrounding ecosystem, the water demand of the city, and the air quality, which in turn affects the people's health. This paper takes a special focus on rapidly growing cities in developing countries. The reason that is because rapid growth generally comes along with a lack of city planning.
One large example, or well-known example, of this UHI, or the urban heat island, would be Mexico City. Mexico City is surrounded by mountains and thus creates a large amount of smog that gets trapped within the city, and it traps in heat itself and then thus just continually heats up and pollutes the air.
Exactly. Like if you were to look at a city through a thermal camera, there would be the obvious sources of heat like cars and whatnot, but that effectively concentrates where there are a lot of people. And you get substantially different temperatures in cities versus out in the country or just in smaller communities, small towns, and places like that. So they were given a special focus to rapidly growing cities, and typically this lack of city planning exaggerates the effects of urban heat islands because green space is quickly and usually carelessly replaced with what's known as impervious surface. Impervious surface is a fancy term that is just a surface that water can't pass through. So that includes buildings, brick, pavement, glass, anything like that. Even really densely packed soil can be considered impervious surface. Green space is defined as some combination of vegetated spaces in parks or along roads or even in people's residencies. What green space does for us is to provide shade and also to absorb a lot of the radiation from the sun through the process of photosynthesis, which in turn cools the surrounding area down. So similar to how a collection of impervious surface can lead to a spike in heat, a collection of green surface can lead to a reduction in heat. One of the goals with this research was to understand the heating effect and its causes such that developing nations can develop while also minimizing the thermal effects on their cities. It turns out the manner in which you expand plays an important role in generated heat, as well as the size of the grids within the city, but we'll get more into that later. The city the researchers focused on here, as mentioned in the title, was Lucknow City in India. For reference, New York City in the United States, which is probably considered a fairly stable city as far as population goes, grows at about 0.2% per year according to the census, while Lucknow grows about 2.5% per year, so this is considered pretty high, a pretty rapidly growing place. So the city of Lucknow, let's talk about that for a little bit. It is the capital city of the Uttar Pradesh state, and it lies on the bank of the Gomti River. Both banks of the Gomti River actually, because the river splits the city in two. The southern half of the city carries most of the dense regions, but both halves are growing in a very rapid manner. The city experiences 3 seasons, and those include summer, winter, and a monsoon season, with temperatures as high as 45 degrees Celsius. So that's pretty hot. That's the equivalent of 113 Fahrenheit.
An interesting thing about this city in general is because it is split with a river, that allows for a lot of heat dissipation and a lot of airflow that usually isn't allowed in most urban cities.
Yeah, and airflow is actually a really important concept. If you've ever seen heat sinks on an electronic component, they look kind of like fins coming off of that object, and the whole purpose is that extra mass pulls heat away from the core, and airflow can kind of carry it off of those fins. So tall buildings kind of serve the same purpose. They can bring heat away from the ground, then provided there's enough ventilation with the city, or in this case, a large river, air can cool off the buildings and play an important role there.
Exactly, and the reason why heat sinks have a lot of fins is because it allows for them to have a higher surface area, which helps dissipate the heat, because the more surface area you have, the more heat you can dissipate. We can go into an equation another time, but there are equations for that.
Right, yeah. Between 2005 and 2016, the city expanded a lot thanks to a big booming economy, specifically with business in IT and manufacturing and a little bit of research. Using satellite data collected at those times, the researchers were able to classify 4 types of spaces within the city. It's 2 of which we've already talked about, the impervious surfaces and the green surfaces, but they also were classifying water and then an others category for everything else. During this 11-year period, there was a remarkable increase in the amount of impervious surface and an even bigger decrease in the amount of green space. Now, I can't share the exact numbers, but this paper is available online if you're interested. They specifically focused on the areas within the city that had the highest temperatures, those urban heat islands we mentioned earlier. And they correlated the temperatures of those areas to the density of impervious and green surfaces in those areas. Unsurprisingly, they found that there is a direct positive correlation between surface temperature and impervious surface density, and a negative correlation between surface temperature and green surface density. That's basically just saying that the more green you have in an area, the more it helps cool it down. Something else they found, which is interesting, was the effects of different types of expansion. And by this we mean the manner in which the new areas are built up. So there are a few different types of these, which I'll go over. In a nutshell, there are 4 that we'll talk about. There's leapfrog, infill, edge, and ribbon expansion. So with leapfrog expansion, if you imagine the footprint that a frog might leave jumping from place to place, it just leaves spots that are isolated from each other. So the city would develop in isolated patches, not necessarily having much contact with each other besides a few roads. Infill is the development of available space that's encapsulated within an already developed area. So if you could imagine a city with an unused plot of land right in the middle of it, and they decide to start building on it, that would be an example of infill expansion. Edge expansion is exactly what it sounds like. It's just expanding from the fringes of the population you already have. And ribbon expansion is basically when you have a road that sees a lot of traffic and more commerce or more growth occurs from that road outwards. So what they found is that infilling was the worst for causing higher surface temperatures, and leapfrogging was the best. And there was actually a really significant difference in the temperatures between these 2 types of regions, even within the same city on the same days. Edge and ribbon development were somewhere in the middle. What this means is that city planners and government officials, especially those in rapidly developing areas, should be aware of the way that they're developing their cities and the way they plan them out. They should use research like this to minimize the environmental effects of their cities and also to maximize their people's health. The researchers recommend combating high surface temperatures in urban hotspots by increasing the green surface density there. You could use parks, roadside plants, or green roofs. You could also use ponds or fountains to produce a cooling effect. In this city, they have a river, which is really useful for a lot of reasons, actually. But in the paper, they mentioned that the cooling effect of a body of water can affect as far as half a mile away from the water. So that's pretty substantial as well.
Well, sounds like there was a lot of good information in this paper. We're going to head off to the ad break, and we'll continue on teaching you about some things that we thought were interesting within the paper and some other research related to the paper that we did. So welcome back. one of the things that Luke touched on a little bit that I thought was really interesting is green roofs. So I did a little personal research into that. If you don't know what green roofs involve creating a waterproof membrane on top of a building, and then from there creating a soil layer, and plants are planted into that soil and grown on top of a building. This allows for a lot of benefits to the building and the heating of the urban area around it in general. So one of the big pros of this is that the plants themselves help with runoff. They can help reduce a lot of runoff and also slow its movement from coming down from the building. So this helps with a lot of rainy areas such as Seattle or the Pacific Northwest in general. And along with slowing the water, it also filters the water as it goes. So hopefully the streets will be filled with cleaner water than they had before. Another pro is that green roofs create a habitat for animals and critters to live in. Bringing wildlife back into an urban environment allows for animals to live back with humans, where we did push them off into their own environments, into whether it be forests or ponds or whatnot. We're able to coexist together in a mutual relationship again. Another great pro of it is that it actually helps with heating and cooling within a building system. So it allows for heating to work by insulating the building. So in the winter, the soil layer and the waterproof membrane actually act as an insulator to trap the heat within the building, and the soil itself will control the heat, and this allows for less electricity and less modulation of a heating source in general. So you might be wondering how it can relate to heating and cooling. Well, it can relate to cooling in the summer with evaporative cooling, which is a way that plants actually deal with excess water and water within their system. It evaporates and creates what most people see as dew or other states of water on plants. And this actually helps to cool a building down or just cool the surroundings of the building, which is very important. The plants themselves also have some processes that they go through that will help reduce CO2 emissions within the building by converting CO2 to oxygen. If green roofs are used on an industrial scale for power plants or power generation facilities, they can help reduce the CO2 emissions of those plants by insulating them better, because usually a lot of power plants have a lot of CO2 emissions due to just heat being let go and heat just going out into the environment, where if it's better insulated, it's actually going to be able to trap that heat better.
Plus you get a nice little rooftop patio.
Yeah. Although we've gone through a lot of pros of the green roofs, there are some cons. So they are expensive to put in initially, as is with most systems in general, whether it be for the environment or not. A lot of changes to a building are expensive. Another con, although we talked about the pro of being able to have animals and critters live alongside of humans, it also introduces mosquitoes, flies, and possibly other unwanted pests into the environment where they usually wouldn't be. Another con is that a lot of infrastructure changes might need to be made to a building to make green roofs possible. One thing to worry about would be waterproofing of the building. So the waterproof membrane can usually sustain its water really well, but things such as animals or the plant roots itself could break through that membrane and lead to seepage into the building, which would be detrimental to a lot of buildings. The weight of the system can also be very heavy, and that a lot of buildings can't handle that weight. So it's very hard to retrofit a building to be able to use a green roof. And that's why a lot of companies are actually reaching out to those building new buildings and seeing if they can introduce green roofs right away rather than having to add them later on. So then they can think about the infrastructure before they're too late.
Another reason why it's good to look at these things in developing countries versus retrofitting.
Yes. Another actual benefit of using green roofs, it extends the longevity of the roof's life in general, because one of the studies I was looking at actually showed that green roofs can improve the lifespan of a roof by almost 200%, which is a significant amount for those who have ever replaced shingles, have ever replaced any kind of roofing. It's tough to do and expensive. You have a lot of initial costs to green roofs, but you get a lot of additional benefits with them compared to a traditional roof system.
I was thinking too, you could also, if you had an apartment building or a condo or something like that with a flat enough roof where you could do something like this, you could also have like a communal garden or something like that.
Yeah, that would be a fantastic way to do it. Be able to create a community around it.
Mm-hmm.
I know that Berlin is doing a lot of research into green roofs, and just in America, if you look at Detroit, a lot of people actually converted some of the old buildings in Detroit into having green roofs and other sort of habitats within the buildings, which I think is a very cool way to deal with broken down or unused buildings.
I was about to say that, like, in the decrepit buildings that weren't being used anymore, like habitats in those.
Yeah.
Interesting.
If you want to learn more about it, I found an organization called Green Roof for Healthy Cities, or GRHC. They have a calculator on their website that, in their words, compares the annual energy performance of a building with a vegetative green roof. So this allows for you to actually figure out how much it would cost and how much it would benefit you to switch over to a green roof system for personal use. In general, it would be easier for industries and building companies to use green roofs, but it can be brought into a personal level if you have the capital for it. The GRHC also has simulations to show the benefits on what the changes would be for switching over to green roof, which I find very interesting and very user-friendly if you want to check that out.
Yeah, that is pretty cool. I only had one nerd note, really, and it's all about the manner in which they collected this data. So like I said earlier, they used satellite data for a lot of their information and verified it through other means. But one of the things I thought was interesting was they determined that different grid sizes, if you think of like a city grid, how big the block is, different grid sizes correspond to varying levels of abilities for that grid to give off heat or absorb heat or have a temperature gain. So they decided to look into this whole what's the most efficient grid size, or more specifically, what's the most inefficient grid size. What size grid leads to the worst ability to vent heat? And what they found was that there is in fact an optimal grid size if for some reason your goal was to increase your surface temperature. But if that's not it, which I would hope it isn't, then this number would be kind of what you'd shoot for staying under. You'd want the grid to be smaller than that for the sake of allowing heat to be vented out. How they were able to determine this was by simply counting the pixels of the satellite data. So the satellite would take pictures, right, and it would record other data as well. But looking at the pixel sizes, they just corresponded to certain pixel size was equivalent to however many meters. And that's how they were able to tell the ideal grid size. So I thought that was pretty cool, just how they were able to use historical data from satellites that have been, flying around the planet for decades. Maybe not decades, but at least one. This study took place over 11 years. But that's all I had. That's the paper.
Well, thank you for tuning in today. I hope you learned some stuff. We definitely did. And just to reiterate, this paper was titled Analyzing the Impact of Changing Landscape Pattern and Dynamics on Land Surface Temperature of Lucknow City, India. The researchers that did this were Anuja Shukla and Kamal Jain at the Indian Institute of Technology, Roorkee. The paper will be appearing in the Research Journal of Urban Forestry and Urban Greening and has been published already by Elsevier. So as usual, if you like the show, please check us out on Instagram. It's epi.stem. Give us a follow, like our posts, subscribe.
Do all those things. And if you want to go above and beyond, reach out to us, give us some thoughts or ideas. Maybe you're involved in some research that you want to share with the world. You can reach us at epistem.pod@gmail.com.
And if you're feeling real generous today, you can hit us up on Patreon. That's patreon.com/epistem.
And remember, if you think your city is cool, it's actually probably warm.